The greatest empires in history, they fell. And they fell to things an army couldn't fight. I'm talking about shadow monopolies, hidden networks. They controlled the food people ate. They controlled the gods people prayed to. It's a story about control, about the true levers of power and collapse. You see a single cartel, secretive. It could dictate the price. The price of an empire's survival, and the most valuable commodity. It was never gold. It was control. Control itself. That was the real force. And you have to wonder, what invisible force holds that power now? So this hidden force, it wasn't a single business. It was a system, a silent system of exclusive control, a network, a web. Its members could be high priests, or elite merchant families, or members of a royal court. Their power wasn't written down. It wasn't on a public charter. It was whispered in temples. Sealed in private contracts, they controlled access, but not just to physical things, not just grain or timber. They controlled access to what an empire really ran on. Divine favor, essential knowledge, the routes and rules of long-distance trade. This created a dependency, a deep, structural dependency. An empire might command vast armies, but it couldn't command the harvest. It couldn't interpret the will of the gods, not without permission from this network. The Oracle of Delphi, she's the perfect example. A single voice, a priestess in a remote temple, and kings and generals would travel for weeks, bearing immense wealth, just to hear her cryptic words. Why? Because she held a monopoly on communication with the divine. Her ambiguous prophecies could launch fleets or cancel invasions. She didn't control soldiers. She controlled certainty, and that was far more powerful. That's the architecture. The power of these shadow monopolies was veiled, woven into the fabric of what everyone considered normal. Religion, trade, law, state ceremony. To challenge them was to challenge the cosmos, or the economy, or the king's own legitimacy. They became untouchable, operating in plain sight yet beyond reach. And by the time an empire realized how completely it depended on them, the trap was already sprung. To see how this worked, to watch an empire walk blindly into this dependency, we look at a civilization that mastered the earth, yet failed to see the strings above. The blueprint for silent control was written in clay 5,000 years ago. In the land between two rivers, a new power structure was forming. It centered on a place called Annona, the temple complex at Uruk. To people, it was the house of the goddess Annona, a sacred space, but in practice it became something else: the central bank, the state warehouse, the sole interpreter of cosmic law. The priests held a monopoly that was absolute because it was a monopoly on certainty. They alone could read the signs from the gods. They said when to plant, when to harvest, what laws were just. A king's right to rule depended on their blessing. Without it, he was just a man with soldiers, and soldiers cannot command the rain. This spiritual authority meant material control. All surplus grain from the community's labor went into the temple granaries. The priests managed huge workforces. They built canals, maintained walls. And they pioneered the concept of credit. They issued clay tablets inscribed with debts and obligations. If you needed seed for next season, you went to the temple. You received it, and your debt was recorded in hardened clay. This wasn't just an economy. It was a system of total dependency, woven from reverence and necessity. The king and the temple were partners, but it was uneven. The king provided protection, order. The temple provided the divine mandate, the logistical backbone that made that order possible. For generations, this created stability. Cities grew, art flourished, empires formed, but the fragility was hidden in its strength. When the inevitable shock came, like a long drought, the temple's role changed. Those granaries full of grain, once a symbol of security, became a tool of leverage. The priests, as the sole distributors, could choose who ate and who did not. They could demand higher favors, greater concessions, more absolute obedience in exchange for survival. What was a sacred duty of stewardship could twist, slowly, into a mechanism of exploitation. The people's faith was still strong, but beneath it a new current began, a quiet discontent. The seeds of distrust were sown not by invaders, but by the very institution meant to be the foundation. This was the template, the perfect, silent merger of heaven and earth, faith and finance, and once this model was proven, it would be copied, adapted, refined for millennia to come. That idea of sacred control, it didn't stay in the river valleys. It found its clearest form, maybe its most ruthless form, out on the open sea. The Bronze Age, all that glitter, the chariots, the palaces, the epic poems, it was built on something fragile, an invisible web, a web made from two metals. Copper and tin, on their own, they're soft, useful but limited, but you combine them, you get bronze, the alloy that defined everything. It made the swords, the tools, the symbols of power, and the supply of those metals. That was a secret, held by very few people. It was the first real international shadow monopoly. A cartel, merchant princes, ship captains, they didn't rule kingdoms, they decided which kingdoms could rule. The geography was stark. Copper mostly came from Cyprus. The name itself echoes the word for copper. Tin was rarer, only a few distant, treacherous sources. The mines in Cornwall at the edge of the world, mysterious routes through Central Asia. Getting these metals meant long voyages. Pirate-infested seas, overland caravans through hostile territory. That risk created a bottleneck. Only the wealthiest families, with generations of knowledge, with trusted port agreements, could manage it. They became the indispensable middlemen to empires. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece. These merchants weren't subjects, they were partners. And then, gradually, they were masters of a subtle leverage. The cartel's power was the power of artificial scarcity. They could whisper about bandits on the eastern routes, storms in the Western Sea. They could delay a shipment, quietly prioritize one king's order over another. The price wasn't just gold, it was political favor. Exclusive trade rights, sometimes a promise of non-aggression. A kingdom's entire military capacity, its ability to equip an army, secure its frontiers, it hung on the arrival of the next tin convoy. This wasn't an open market, it was a closed network, and everyone in it was vulnerable to that silent pressure. Then, around 1200 BCE, the network snapped. It wasn't one event, it was a cascade. Climate shifts maybe caused poor harvests, famine, that triggered migrations, unrest, piracy exploded, the sea lanes became untenable. The guarded overland routes collapsed into chaos. The merchant princes lost control because the system itself was unraveling, and without that steady flow of tin and copper, the whole edifice of Bronze Age civilization began to crumble. Palaces that depended on bronze tools for construction, for administration, they couldn't function. Armies couldn't be rearmed. The intricate international diplomacy, built on exchanging bronze gifts, it broke down. What followed wasn't a simple recession. It was a systems failure, so complete that the Mediterranean world plunged into centuries of isolation, depopulation, lost literacy. We call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, a dark age. The lights of empire went out, and it shows something. These early globalized economies were deeply interconnected. But that interconnection was their greatest weakness. They built a world of shining bronze, but the supply chain was a single, fragile thread, held by shadowy hands. When those hands let go, everything they held up came crashing down. That collapse taught a brutal lesson about dependency, and in its wake, a new power structure would arise. One that learned from that fragility. It wouldn't rely on a cartel of merchants. It would seek to own the source itself, to control not just the trade, but the very earth from which power sprang. The collapse of bronze taught a lesson about controlling the source. One empire learned it better than anyone. They built their monopoly not on a rare metal, but on the surface of thought itself. Papyrus that read from the Nile marshes, it became the ultimate tool of control. For 2,000 years, Egypt's power was written on its scrolls. The state didn't just make papyrus. It owned the entire process from the swamp to the scribe's hand, and that gave them a grip on reality. Think about papyrus. It was the paper of the ancient world. The cloud server, the filing cabinet, every treaty, every tax record, every sacred hymn, every royal decree, it all lived on these sheets, but making it was a state secret. A complex alchemy of harvesting, soaking, pressing, drying the reeds. The best workshops were in temples and royal palaces, places called scriptoria. Armies of scribes worked there, trained from childhood. They mastered intricate scripts, hieroglyphs for monuments, a sacred code, hieratic for everyday administration, a flowing hand. This knowledge was a wall. To be a scribe was to join a privileged caste, the ultimate civil servant. They managed grain stores, calculated labor for the pyramids, wrote the laws and the histories. They were the operating system of the empire. They controlled the user interface. This created a profound filter. What was written down became official truth. What wasn't faded into rumor, a pharaoh's legacy, a military campaign's success, the favor of the gods, it was all curated by this bureaucratic class. Their styluses didn't just record power, they enacted it, and this control reached far beyond Egypt. Every kingdom from Babylon to the Aegean needed papyrus for diplomacy. To send a message to Pharaoh, you used his paper. To archive a treaty, you used his paper. This wasn't just stationery. It was a constant reminder of dependency. Egypt held the ledger of the ancient world. Want to be part of international affairs, you played by their medium on their terms. The monopoly seemed eternal. But its weakness was in its exclusivity. The system was too perfect, too closed. Change came from the edges, from societies outside the papyrus curtain. Around the Mediterranean, artisans began experimenting with animal skins, scraping and stretching them into parchment. It was tougher, more durable, and crucially, it could be made anywhere you had livestock. Then came the real revolution, not of material but of mind, the alphabet, a system of 24 simple signs that could capture speech, unlike Egypt's thousands of complex hieroglyphs. It was portable knowledge. You didn't need 20 years of temple training to learn it. Parchment and the alphabet together were a democratizing earthquake. Now a merchant in Tyre could keep his own accounts. A poet in Greece could compose without a royal patron. Laws could be written on public displays for all to see, not just for priests to interpret. The flow of information began to bypass the gatekeepers. Egypt's soft power, which had flowed from its scriptoria, slowly drained away. They still had the pyramids. They still had the grain, but they had lost their monopoly on memory. The pen and the power it held was escaping into the world, and as it did, a new kind of empire was learning a different lesson. Not how to hoard knowledge, but how to weaponize belief, building a monopoly not on paper but on the human soul. Egypt was losing its written knowledge. And in China, there was a different struggle over salt. In those warring states, this mineral was survival. Armies needed it to march, food needed it to last. Control salt, and you control the possibility of life and power. One man understood this, Guanzhong. He was chief minister to the Duke of Kai centuries before the Common Era. He saw the coastal salt pans and he saw a treasury. He proposed a radical idea, a state monopoly, the first one fully documented. The government would own every step. Boiling the brine, selling the final cakes, no one else could produce or sell it. The consequences were severe, the brilliance was subtle. The state could fund its armies, build its walls, pay its officials without ever announcing a new tax. The cost was hidden, folded into the price of a necessity, a thing every family had to buy. It was a fiscal weapon disguised as commerce. Kai grew wealthy, powerful. It dominated its rivals not just through battlefield strength, but through this quiet economic stranglehold. The model was a blueprint. Centuries later, the Han Dynasty perfected it. They created the Salt and Iron Commission, a vast bureaucracy. It managed production, set prices. It became the empire's largest source of revenue. That revenue funded campaigns, pushed back the northern nomads. It built infrastructure, unified a continent. The salt monopoly was the economic engine for China's golden age, but it had a dark side. The commission became a target for corruption. Officials could manipulate supply, drive up prices, create artificial scarcity for private gain. For the peasant farmer already struggling, the price of salt could become an unbearable burden. Resentment simmered. There were debates at court, famous discourses on salt and iron. Scholars argued this state control was oppressive, that it impoverished the people to enrich the government. This struggle over the white gold shaped Chinese statecraft for millennia. Dynasties rose and fell, but the question remained: who controls the essential thing? The salt syndicates showed that power could be baked into the most humble substance. It wasn't about owning land, it was about controlling the process. The process that made life on that land possible. This was a monopoly of a different scale, not on ideas, not on luxury metals, on a daily, universal need. It showed the most effective shadow monopoly might not be shadowy at all. It could be an official government bureau operating in broad daylight. Its control so embedded in daily life it became invisible. Until the price became too high, this model of state-controlled necessity would echo beyond China. But as empires grew more complex, their vulnerabilities grew too. The next great monopoly would target something else, not the body, not the mind, something more elusive: the passage of time and the human connection to the eternal. Pepper could cost a legionary's entire year's pay. A small sack of those black, wrinkled berries worth more than months of a man's labor. That wasn't just scarcity. That was a shadow monopoly, a sophisticated one. It turned a seasoning into a kind of weapon. The journey was perilous but controlled. It grew on the Malabar coast. In India, a world away, to reach Rome, it sailed on monsoons, then crossed deserts on camel trains, through a gauntlet of kingdoms of bandits, and at every choke point a cartel took its cut. Indian merchants sold to Arabian traders. They mastered the sea routes. Then Nabatean caravans carried it north. Their hidden city, Petra, was a fortress of commerce. And finally, inside the empire's borders, the Roman equestrians took control. They weren't nobles, but their wealth built the politics of Rome. The system was a closed loop. Exclusive knowledge, shared risk. Only these networks knew the safe harbors, the desert wells, the customs of distant ports. They inflated the price for profit, yes, but also to maintain the mystique, to keep the empire on the hook. For the Roman elite, pepper was more than spice. It was a symbol, proof of civilization's reach. They craved it for feasts, used it in medicines, paid ransoms with it. But every peppercorn on a patrician's plate meant silver bullion, solid Roman wealth flowing out. Forever, the trade was a one-way street. Rome had little the East wanted besides cold, hard currency. Year after year, chests of silver denarii sailed east, draining the imperial treasury to feed a luxury. Emperors saw the danger. Tiberius complained about the wealth spent on eastern vanities, on silks, gems, spice. He tried to pass laws to restrict the spending, but the monopoly was too powerful, too woven into the prestige of the ruling class. The equestrians who controlled the trade were also the empire's bankers. Its shipowners, its contractors. To attack the spice cartel was to attack the financial pillars of Rome. The state was captive to its own elite's appetites. That created a hidden fracture, a slow bleed of economic sovereignty. Rome's might was built on its legions, its laws, yet its luxury, its idea of status, depended on networks it could not secure. could not even fully map a revolt in Arabia, a shift in monsoon patterns, a new power in Persia. Any disruption thousands of miles away could send shockwaves through the forums of Rome. Spiking prices, stirring unrest, the empire became precariously dependent on a supply chain of whispers and rumors, controlled by middlemen whose loyalty was to profit, not to Rome. They built a world where taste came at the price of autonomy, where the flavor of power made the empire vulnerably connected, irrevocably connected to a world beyond its control. And as that silver drained away, it left a hollowed-out economy, one that would struggle to pay the armies that defended it. That lesson in dependency wouldn't be forgotten. It would resurface centuries later in a colder climate, where the ultimate monopoly wouldn't be on a spice, but on the very right to dream of heaven. That Roman silver going east, it bought more than pepper. It bought a filter, a huge, invisible filter, thousands of miles long, the Silk Road. We imagine it as this open highway. A free exchange of ideas, but it wasn't like that. It was controlled. The caravans carried more than silk and spices. They carried the seeds of empires. A blueprint for a stirrup, the secret of paper, and the leagues running those caravans. They had a kind of power, a power most kings didn't have. They didn't just move innovation. They decided if it would ever arrive. Take the Sogdians. Their cities were oases out in the Central Asian desert, Samarkand, Bukhara. To a traveler, they were safe havens. But in history, they were switchboards. Every piece of information, every crate moving between China and Persia, between India and Rome, it all passed through their hands. They spoke a dozen languages. They knew every desert well, every mountain pass. That logistical mastery gave them a quiet authority. They became the indispensable middlemen. And they learned something. They learned that some knowledge was worth more if it moved slowly. Consider paper, invented in China, 2nd century before the Common Era. A revolutionary technology, lighter than bamboo, cheaper than silk, but it took centuries to reach the Islamic world, longer to get to Europe. Why? The Sogdian and Parthian traders controlling the routes. They had no incentive to rush. They profited from the system already in place. Transporting finished paper as a luxury good, that was one thing. Transporting the artisans, the tools, the precise recipe, that was different. That would end their monopoly on the product itself. So the knowledge dripped out in fragments with deliberate delays, the same story with the stirrup. A simple loop of leather and metal, it revolutionized warfare, gave a mounted warrior stability. It likely started in Asia, but its adoption in Europe was slow. Piecemeal, the merchant gatekeepers understood its value. They could charge a king's ransom for a set of advanced saddles, or they could withhold the complete technical understanding. Ensure a continued dependence. They weren't just selling a product, they were leasing a military advantage on an installment plan. This was the shadow monopoly. The monopoly over logistical knowledge. It wasn't written down in any agreement, it was practiced. A Parthian trader might lose a shipment of glass-blowing tools for a season. A Sogdian guide might describe only the hardest mountain path, hiding the easier one. They controlled the narrative of distance itself. For Rome, for Han China, these were frustrating barriers. Opaque, their empires were mighty, but they were at the ends of the earth. They depended on these intermediaries for intelligence, for technology, for a true picture of the world. That dependency meant they got innovations late, and often in a degraded form, incomplete. Technological parity was impossible because the flow of knowledge was being metered by a confederation of merchants whose loyalty was to the route itself, not to any empire it connected. The result was a throttling of progress for centuries. Continents developed in isolation, not from a lack of ideas, but because the pipeline between them had valves, very careful valves. The gatekeepers grew immensely wealthy. Their cities became centers of dazzling culture, built on this controlled exchange. They shaped history not by conquest but by selection. by deciding what passed through and what waited in the desert for another season. That quiet power over the movement of ideas, it would eventually be shattered, not by a rival empire, by an event so devastating it rewrote all the rules of trade. It created a new form of monopoly, more absolute, one that would cloak itself not in silk but in absolute faith. The desert caravans controlled the flow of things, but in the Greek world there was a temple that controlled the flow of meaning. That was Delphi. It was on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. It was more than a shrine, it was a clearinghouse for the Greek soul, and its currency was ambiguity. People came from everywhere, from Sparta, from Athens, from the colonies. They brought their questions: when to plant a colony, whether to go to war, whom to marry, the future of everything, asked in a whisper. The priestess, the Pythia, would go into a trance. Her answers were never clear. They were riddles, they were metaphors open to interpretation, and that was the point. The ambiguity wasn't a mistake. It was the feature. It meant you had to go back to the temple priests. They were the only ones who could unravel the divine word for a fee, so the priests of Apollo had a monopoly on something priceless. The interpretation of fate, but the oracle's power wasn't just spiritual, it was material. The temple became the safest bank in the ancient world. City-states built their own treasury buildings right there on the grounds. They stored their surplus wealth, gold, silver, offerings, because an attack on Delphi was an attack on all of Greece. The sanctity of the place was a better defense than any wall. The temple, tax-exempt, began to manage that wealth. It issued loans to cities, it funded public works, it became the first pan-Hellenic central bank. A financial network woven through shared faith that created a feedback loop of soft power. A king thinking about war would consult the oracle. The priests had an intelligence network. Travelers, diplomats, they could shape the response. A vague prophecy could nudge him toward peace or toward a colonial venture that served Greek interests. They could direct the flow of ambition. The treasure there was staggering, a temptation, but for centuries that religious authority held. It showed that control didn't always need an army. It could be built on a collective belief, a belief in a sacred, unassailable space, a space that held your gold and your destiny. Delphi's model showed that economic and spiritual power fused could guide civilizations. But this fusion would reach its most potent form later, in an empire that claimed a monopoly not on a place but on a pathway, the only pathway to salvation. The oracles had spiritual capital, but in Rome the lever of control was more basic. It was bread, the grain dole, the Annona. It started as a safety net for the citizens. But it became the most powerful political machine in the ancient world. It began with a discovery. In the late Republic, populist politicians found that a hungry man votes with his stomach. Men like Clodius Pulcher passed laws for free grain. It wasn't charity, it was a transaction, loyalty bought by the bushel. The mobs in the forums, cheering or rioting, they were powered by that guaranteed meal. Then Augustus saw the system's real potential. He didn't end it, he nationalized it. He brought the Annona under the imperial household. Suddenly, it wasn't the Senate providing bread. It was the emperor. His face was on the grain tokens. Every loaf was a personal gift from the princeps, a daily reminder of where power was and who held the key to survival. The population of Rome, nearly 1 million, became clients on a colossal scale. Their dependence was the foundation, but to feed a city that large required a shadow empire. Rome produced almost no grain itself. It needed Egypt's harvests, the wheat from Sicily and North Africa. That meant controlling a supply chain thousands of miles long. The emperor appointed special merchants, the navicularii. They got privileges, tax breaks, even imperial insurance for their ships. In return, they formed a state-mandated cartel. A monopoly on moving the Annona grain. No one else could move those millions of bushels. This network of shippers and bakers became a hidden bureaucracy. Its only purpose was to keep grain flowing into the massive warehouses, the Horia. The system created an engineered peace. As long as the grain ships sailed into Ostia, the emperor could rule. The people were fed and therefore quiet, but that peace was fragile. The whole arrangement was a bet on perfect logistics, a storm season that sank too many ships. A revolt in Egypt, a bad harvest in 2 provinces at once. Any of that could mean empty granaries and a starving populace. The Annona turned food security from a public good into an instrument of control. The emperor didn't just hold the sword, he held the ladle. This was a monopoly of a different kind, not on a luxury, but on the fundamental prerequisite for life in the capital. It made Rome mighty and profoundly vulnerable. Its strength was anchored in a supply line it could never fully secure. The Dole bought loyalty, but it also manufactured a permanent systemic risk. The empire had built a trap. The price of order was eternal dependence on the weather and the loyalty of distant provinces. And when that system began to falter, centuries later, the unraveling started not at the borders, but in the stomach of the city. A blade of pure black glass, sharper than steel, that could only come from one place, the volcanic highlands, where the earth bled a dark, perfect stone. Obsidian, it was the lifeblood of civilization, for cutting wood, for hunting, for sacred ritual, and the city that mastered its flow became a god among cities. Teotihuacan, the name means the place where one becomes a deity. Its power was carved from that volcanic glass. The city didn't just sit near the great Pachuca obsidian mines. It annexed them. It built a monopoly so complete it became invisible. The raw stone was quarried by controlled labor, brought back to the city's workshops. Master artisans, under priestly supervision, crafted it into specific forms, standardized knife blades for butchery, razor-sharp dart points, and the exquisite ceremonial blades. Those dark mirrors, those sacrificial knives, these weren't just tools, they were religious artifacts, consecrated objects. You couldn't just make one. You had to receive one from the right people in the right ceremony. This fusion was brilliant. Economic control dressed in ritual necessity. A local chieftain hundreds of miles away, wanting authority, needed these symbols. The finely worked obsidian blade proved his connection to Teotihuacan's gods, proved his access to the central source of spiritual power. To receive such a gift was to enter an alliance. An alliance with expectations, loyalty, tribute, perhaps military support. The city's influence pulsed outward along these channels of ritual exchange. Not through marching armies, they built an empire of the mind, secured with blades of black glass. For centuries, this system held. Teotihuacan grew into a metropolis of over 100,000. Its pyramids of the sun and moon dominated the landscape. Its art was copied from Guatemala to the deserts of northern Mexico. It was the unquestioned center. But the monopoly contained the seeds of its own fragility. The model depended on exclusive access, on being the sole broker between the raw earth and the divine ceremony. But other cities like Colula and later Maya centers developed their own workshops. They found alternative sources of obsidian. They began to produce their own ritual goods, breaking the symbolic stranglehold. And the very best veins of Pachuca obsidian, the flawless black glass, may have begun to run thin. Exhaustion of the prime resource, combined with rising competition, eroded the foundation. The decline wasn't sudden, it was a slow leak of authority. The gifts from the city lost their exclusive luster. Alliances frayed as alternatives appeared. The economic engine that funded Teotihuacan's grandeur began to sputter. By the time the city's ceremonial center was burned and abandoned around the 6th century, its monopoly had long since dissolved. The power had leaked back into the earth from which it came. This was the paradox, the very ritual that made the commodity so powerful, so indispensable, also made the monopoly vulnerable. Once the ceremony could be performed with a blade from another source, the magic was broken. Control evaporated. It showed that the most potent shadow monopolies are those that convince you there is no alternative. And when that illusion shatters, the civilization built upon it can quietly turn to dust. The power of Obsidian faded after the ceremony, but up north in the frozen parts, another monopoly was forming. This one wasn't built on sharpness, it was built on captured light, on amber. This golden fossilized resin washing up on the Baltic shores, it was more than jewelry. To the ancient world, it was solidified sunlight, a piece of magic you could hold, and the journey it took southward, that was a shadow highway, controlled by tribes who became gatekeepers. Gatekeepers of the sun itself. From the Baltic coast, the route snaked south, down the Vistula River, across the plains, through dense forests, unknown forests. At every river crossing, every narrow pass, there was a local chieftain, a tribe controlling the toll. They were the intermediaries, the Jastorf culture in northern Germany. The Lusatian people further east, they didn't just tax the amber, they guarded the knowledge of the paths, the safe fords, the seasonal schedules. For a merchant from the Mediterranean, venturing into those misty woods was unthinkable. So the trade worked in relays. A piece of amber might pass through a dozen hands. A dozen hands before it ever saw the Aegean sun. This created a cascading monopoly. Each tribe along the route had a local lock on the traffic. Their wealth came from being a link. A link in the chain, and they used that wealth to import symbols of southern power, bronze from the Alps, gold from the Carpathians, exotic glass beads. These goods flowed north and they transformed local chieftains, turned them into powerful elites. Their status was literally bought with amber. You see a burial mound in Denmark filled with Mediterranean bronze, and that tells the story. That chief's authority was built on his tribe's position, their position as a trusted node in the amber network, and the commodity's value was supercharged by its myth. Egyptians called it the tears of the sun god Ra. They placed it in tombs, believing it held life force. Mycenaean kings wore it as amulets. In Greece, they thought it was the hardened tears. The tears of the sisters of Phaethon mourning his fatal chariot ride. This wasn't a simple luxury trade. It was a trade in belief. The northern tribes weren't just selling a pretty stone. They were selling a piece of solar divinity, sourced from the edge of the world, that gave them incredible leverage, but it also built a house of cards. The entire system depended on stability, the stability of every single link in that long, fragile chain. A conflict between two tribes on the Polish plains could shut the route down for a season. A shift in climate could change river levels, make transport impossible. A new power rising in the south, like the aggressive Assyrians, could redirect trade flows, could create new demands entirely, and that's exactly what could happen. If a southern empire developed a new source or a new preference for a different luxury, then the demand could dry up. The flow of bronze northward would stop, and the northern chieftains, whose power was based on distributing those imported goods, those prestige goods, they would find their authority evaporating. Their warriors, accustomed to bronze weapons, would be left with stone. Their legitimacy, tied to controlling the sunstone, would turn to dust. A culture could rise to prominence over generations because of its place on the map, and then fade into obscurity just as quickly when the map was redrawn. The amber routes show a different kind of shadow monopoly. It was decentralized. A series of local cartels, each dependent on the next. No single king controlled it all, yet together they dictated the flow of wealth and ideas between the Mediterranean core and the barbarian periphery. They made the north dependent on southern desire and the south dependent on northern secrecy. It was a partnership of mutual dependency and profound mutual fragility. The true power lay not in owning the source, but in controlling the labyrinth. And when the labyrinth's exit was blocked, everyone inside was trapped. That amber labyrinth was built on secrecy, but one empire took secrecy and made it an industrial weapon. the Hittites up in the rocky highlands of Anatolia. They mastered a kind of dark alchemy. They learned to pull strength from stone, not bronze, a new, harder metal, iron, and they didn't just learn it. They locked it away. The Hittite state put an iron curtain around the knowledge itself. This wasn't a monopoly on a rare resource. Iron ore was everywhere. It was a monopoly on the process, the fire, the technique, turning brittle, spongy bloom into a blade that could shatter a bronze sword. That knowledge was a state secret. Guarded like the royal seal, the advantage was immediate, overwhelming. A Hittite army with iron weapons facing opponents still using bronze. In that clash, bronze would bend. It would notch or break. Iron held its edge. That technological leap translated directly into battlefield dominance. For nearly 2 centuries, this secret let the Hittites, from their fortified capital Hattusa, build an empire. One that could stand toe-to-toe with Egypt's wealth. Their treaties with pharaohs weren't signed from weakness. They were from a position of hardened strength. The secret was their ultimate strategic reserve. The system of control was absolute. Iron production was confined to royal workshops, likely within temple or palace complexes. The master smiths weren't free artisans. They were bound to the state, their skills passed down within families under oath. The entire chain, from mining to the final quenching of a sword, happened behind a veil. A veil of royal privilege. Spies caught trying to learn the secrets faced severe consequences. In that world, a skilled smith was more valuable than a regiment of soldiers. But like all monopolies built on exclusivity, it had a fatal flaw. Its survival depended on the empire's stability. When the late Bronze Age collapse swept through the region around 1200 BCE, Hattusa was sacked and burned. The central authority that enforced the secret vanished overnight, and the royal smiths, now displaced and desperate, became the agents of the secret spread. They fled across the crumbling world, trading their knowledge for food, for shelter, for protection. The guarded techniques, the precise temperatures, the charcoal mix, the repeated folding and hammering began to seep out. The democratization of iron was slow but irreversible. Within a few generations, the knowledge was no longer a Hittite secret. It was a tool in the hands of many. And that changed everything. Iron ore was common, far more common than the tin needed for bronze. Now, any local chieftain with a furnace and a skilled worker could arm a force. With weapons that were cheap, effective, durable. The military advantage that had sustained great imperial palaces just evaporated. The old Bronze Age aristocracy, their power built on controlling the scarce tin and copper trade, found their foundation crumbling. Why pay a king's ransom for bronze when you could make serviceable iron from the hills behind your village? The Hittite monopoly proved something. A monopoly on advanced knowledge could be more decisive, more powerful than a monopoly on any physical resource. But it was also more fragile. It couldn't be stockpiled in a vault. It lived in the minds of people, and when the storm came, those minds scattered, carrying the seeds of the old empire's power to its future rivals. They had weaponized a secret only to see it eventually arm the world, arm it against the very idea of such concentrated power. This pattern of a guarded innovation defining an age and then escaping to redefine everything would find a parallel. Far to the east, where a monopoly wouldn't be on metal but on memory, and its keepers wouldn't be smiths, they'd be scribes, scribes who held the power to erase a man from history itself. The Hittites had their metal, but the Inca Empire, they controlled something deeper. They controlled time, human time. In a world without money, without wheels, they built a system where the state owned every person's calendar. That was the mitta, a labor tax, and it was the engine, the invisible engine of the largest empire in the Americas before Columbus. Every person who could work owed days to the state each year. Not paid in silver, paid in sweat. They built the stone roads that crossed the mountains. They carved the terraces into the sides of cliffs. They moved the giant stones for the fortresses. For Sacsayhuaman, for Machu Picchu, this wasn't slavery, not in the usual way. It was a rotation, a shared duty, but in its scale, in its requirement, it was a total monopoly. A monopoly on the workforce, the entire productive force of millions of people, all directed from one place. Managing that colossal project required a bureaucracy. A bureaucracy of perfect precision, and their tool was the Quipu, a bundle of knotted strings. To someone looking at it, it was a tassel, but to a trained reader, a Kipukamayok, it was a record. A database, the colors, the knot positions, the cord lengths, they recorded everything: population, tax debts, grain in the warehouses, history. This was an empire run on string. A physical network of information. It let the Sapa Inca, sitting in Cusco, know how many workers were free in a distant province, or how much maize was in a granary up in the mountains. The Quipu made the labor monopoly possible. It turned human muscle into a number, into something you could count and assign, and the output of that system, the output was a transformed landscape. The empire was woven together by its own labor. The road network, over 25,000 miles of it, let armies and messages move fast. The terraces turned barren slopes into gardens which fed people and reduced risk. The huge stone buildings, they had two purposes. They awed people with the state's power, and they were the infrastructure of control. By monopolizing labor, the Incas didn't just build things. They built cohesion. They physically tied conquered peoples together into one machine. Your town's job might be to maintain a stretch of road so another province's food could reach a third province's soldiers. Everyone was a cog, and the state was the only clockmaker, but that strength, that was also the vulnerability. The whole system rested on two things: the perceived divinity of the Sapa Inca, the absolute ruler, and the perfect, flawless work of the administrators. The mita was accepted because it was a sacred duty to a god-king. The bureaucracy worked because it was loyal, efficient, and nobody challenged it. Then the Spanish came. They didn't just bring guns and disease. They broke the central pillar. They captured the emperor Atahualpa, and they killed him. The divine clock stopped. The administrative class was destroyed by war and sickness. The Quipu readers, the empire's master accountants, lost their standing. And without that central brain, the mita system, the monopoly on labor, it just fell apart. The infrastructure was still there. The Spanish used the Inca roads. They stored food in the Inca granaries, but the cohesive power, the ability to command that whole continent-spanning effort, was gone. The monopoly was broken. And what it shows is a hard lesson. An empire's greatest asset can become its point of total collapse. The Incas had centralized control so completely that removing the center made the whole organism stop. They traded resilience for scale, monumental scale, and in that trade they left behind stones that whisper of a power that didn't control gold, but controlled the motion of a people. A power so absolute it vanished the moment the idea behind it was broken. The scent of sanctity came from one place, the deserts of southern Arabia, where rain was almost forgotten. There were these trees, twisted and tough, that produced frankincense and myrrh. These weren't just luxuries, they were essential for the smoke in temples everywhere, for medicine, for preparing the dead, and they grew nowhere else. That accident of geography created a monopoly, a powerful one, held by kingdoms like Saba, the land of the Queen of Sheba. Their control was total. They owned the groves, they knew how to tap the trees without killing them, and they owned the routes. The incense trail was 700 miles. From Yemen to Gaza, a gauntlet of sand and rock. Every oasis, every pass was a toll station, guarded by Sabaeans. Traveling without permission meant death. They spread stories, myths of winged serpents guarding the groves, divine guardians that would kill intruders. That was psychological warfare, making their monopoly feel like a natural law enforced by gods. The wealth was legendary. It built Marib, a city sustained by a massive dam that turned the desert edge green. It funded the palaces. It was from one of those palaces that the Queen of Sheba set out to see Solomon. Her caravan loaded with incense, gold, spices. The Sabaeans weren't just selling a product, they were selling access to the divine. Every priest needed their resin to reach heaven. For centuries, that made them untouchable, richer than kings with armies, because they commanded the atmosphere of worship itself. But a monopoly based on a land route is fragile. Vulnerable to a change in the wind, a Greek sailor, Hippalus, in the 1st century, he figured out the monsoon winds. He found you could sail from the Red Sea to India and back in a year. That maritime shortcut was an earthquake for the overland cartel. Now Roman merchants could go around the Arabian toll booths. They could bring back spices, silks, even some incense by sea. Cheaper, faster, the ground was shifting under the Sabaeans. The final blow, though, wasn't economic. It was spiritual. The new great religions, Christianity and then Islam. They moved worship in a different direction, away from animal sacrifice, away from massive incense consumption. Their rituals were simpler: prayer, scripture, community. The theological need for huge amounts of aromatic resin just faded. The market for sanctity was redefined. The old suppliers were left with warehouses of a fading magic. The desert kingdoms dwindled, their great dams silted up, their cities were slowly taken back by the dunes. Their power wasn't defeated in battle, it was made obsolete. First by a new map drawn by sailors on the open sea, and then by a new map of heaven drawn by prophets. The color of power was purple, a deep, resonant purple. Tyrian purple. It was the color of empire. To make just 1 gram of it, you needed thousands of a certain sea snail. The murex. They lived only in parts of the eastern Mediterranean. You had to crush them. The process smelled terrible. It took immense labor, and the exact method was a secret. A state secret. Tyre, the Phoenician city, wasn't just selling a dye. It was selling an idea that some people, by what they wore, were closer to the gods. Rome turned that idea into law. Their sumptuary laws said who could wear this purple and how much. A broad purple stripe on your toga meant you were a senator, the highest class. A narrow stripe meant a lower rank. Only the emperor could wear a toga made entirely of the deepest Tyrian purple. To put that on was to wrap yourself in a network that went back to the dye vats in Tyre, through the warehouses of specific merchants, right into Rome's social contract. Your status wasn't just announced, it was bonded to you chemically. The dye was so costly, its value was compared to silver, weight for weight. A robe with a purple border was a walking bank vault. Wealth made visible, which meant power made visible. This created a shadow economy, a system of immense influence. The Phoenician merchants who controlled the trade became indispensable to the Roman elite. They were the only source for the thing that defined the ruling class, that gave them a quiet leverage, a persistent one. Inside the halls of power, they could shape fashion. They could create scarcity to push prices higher. They could be the silent backers of political careers. For all its military strength, the Roman state depended on a few cities across the sea for its clothing. For its symbols, that tension finally broke under Emperor Nero. He issued a decree. He tried to ban private use of Tyrian purple, to reserve it only for the imperial household. This was more than fashion. It was an attack on the old senatorial aristocracy, an attempt to take the monopoly's symbolic power for the throne alone. He wanted to break the network, to make the color about his authority not a class, but the allure was too strong. The social code was too deep. The ban was ignored. It was repealed after he died. It proved some monopolies are woven so tightly into culture that even an emperor can't pull them out. The real end of the purple cartel came from collapse. And from innovation. When Tyre was finally sacked and destroyed, the knowledge fragmented. The infrastructure broke. Centuries later, new powers rose. Cheaper dyes were found, synthetic ones, the magic faded, the color stayed, but its exclusive spell was broken. It shows how a monopoly succeeds best when it sells more than a product. It sells identity. It embeds hierarchy into the skin of society. It makes the invisible lines of class something you can see and touch and wear. Once that connection is made, the commodity becomes sacred. And to challenge it isn't just bad business, it becomes heresy against the established order. A well in the desert was worth more than a mountain of gold. In places where rain was just a memory, water wasn't a resource, it was a weapon. The cities that controlled it became gatekeepers. Their power wasn't built on fertile land. It was built on the arithmetic of thirst. You could have a caravan of 100 camels loaded with silk. They could cross 100 miles of dunes, but without that one known well at the midpoint, it was a procession of ghosts. The Oasis kingdoms understood this. Their whole civilization was built on it. Take Petra, the rose-red city. Its genius wasn't just carving temples from cliffs. It was the water. They channeled every flash flood from the mountains through a narrow canyon, the Sick, into a system of dams and cisterns. They turned a seasonal trickle into a permanent supply. For the Nabateans, this wasn't just city planning. It was their monopoly. Every trader moving between Arabia and the Mediterranean had to pass through that canyon. And they had to pay fees for water for safe passage. That was the lifeblood of Petra's wealth. Their tombs and temples were carved from the profits of managed scarcity. Then further north there was Palmyra, the bride of the desert. It sat between the Roman and Parthian empires. Its power came from its springs. The city's name came from the palm groves fed by its ancient water source. Palmyran merchants didn't just sell goods, they sold survival. They provided guides who knew secret wells. They offered armed protection. Their grand colonnades, their lavish temples, were a monument to being the indispensable middlemen. They taxed not just the goods but the very possibility of the journey. This was a hydraulic monopoly. The power was absolute because the need was absolute. A merchant couldn't negotiate the price of water with dying animals. He paid what was asked. That gave these cities staggering leverage. They could influence which empires received goods. They could favor one trading partner over another by adjusting the fees. Their wealth was immense, but it was fragile, entirely situational, built on a geographic accident and the maintenance of a specific route. And that's why their falls were so complete. Petra's decline began when the Romans mastered sea routes to the east. They bypassed the desert caravans. The flow of wealth moved around the city like water finding a new path. Palmyra's queen Zenobia overreached. She challenged Rome. When her armies were defeated, the Romans didn't just sack the city. They broke its reason for being. They rerouted trade. They built their own fortified wells along new roads. The monopoly was shattered. Without that constant stream of tribute, the water systems fell into disrepair. The gardens withered. The sand reclaimed the stones. Their legacy is a lesson in ephemeral power. The most direct shadow monopoly is control over an absolute necessity in a precarious place. Their empires weren't built on land or ideology. They were built on a bottleneck of liquid. They flourished by being the only tap in a vast dry room. And they vanished the moment someone installed a second tap or simply decided to leave the room. Their ruins stand not as monuments to conquest, but to a brilliant, fleeting calculation. A calculation that evaporated when the map was redrawn. The purple dye and the desert wells, they traded in scarcity, but the deepest shadow monopoly traded in people. It was an economy built not on what someone owned, but on who they were. From the Roman ergastula, those underground prison workshops, to the slave markets of the Black Sea. It was a vast, silent engine. It powered ancient grandeur on a currency of human lives. Official empires, they often didn't dirty their hands with the capture. They outsourced that to specialized networks, pirates roaming the Mediterranean, tribal raiders from beyond the frontier. independent merchant cartels who saw people as just another commodity to transport and sell. These groups operated in the shadows of diplomacy, a brutal supply chain feeding a relentless demand. Take Athens at its height, the cradle of democracy. Its wealth, its cultural flourishing was underwritten by silver. That silver came from the mines at Laurion, and those mines were worked by thousands of enslaved individuals. The ships of the Delian League, which defended Athenian power, they were rowed by citizens but built by enslaved labor. The Parthenon itself, that symbol of perfect beauty, it rose on the backs of this system. The stability of such a society became dependent on a continuous, terrible influx. It created a perverse incentive for perpetual, low-level warfare, not just for land but for captives. It entrenched a social stratification so deep it was considered a natural law. The free citizens' leisure, their time for philosophy and politics, it was purchased with the forced labor of others. This human monopoly did more than build monuments. It shaped a worldview. It required the dehumanization of entire populations, turning complex human beings into simple units of production. The luxury of the elite, the very concept of a life devoted to art and governance, it had this hidden moral cost. It fueled expansion because new territories meant new sources of this human resource. But it also seeded a deep internal decay. A society that rests on such a foundation has to constantly justify it, weaving narratives of superiority and destiny to mask the essential injustice. The rot wasn't in the stones of the buildings, it was in the silent agreement that held the society together. This network, so crucial to power, was also its most profound vulnerability. It made social peace dependent on the suppression and control of a vast, unseen multitude, and when the lines of supply were disrupted, or when the suppressed questioned their chains, the entire edifice could tremble. This was the ultimate shadow monopoly, one that sought to own not just what people did, but what they were, and its legacy is a reminder of how economies can be built on the most fragile and terrible of foundations. The state religion was a public contract, but the human soul wanted something private. Across the Roman Empire, a different market appeared. It traded in salvation. The official gods asked for public sacrifice for the state's welfare. The mystery cults offered something else, an exclusive experience, a transformation. For a price, they became spiritual monopolies. They controlled access to a guaranteed afterlife, a direct line to a savior god, the deep comfort of a secret community. The cult of Isis came from Egypt. It promised resurrection, eternal life. The rituals were elaborate, they were costly, deeply emotional. Initiates paid heavy fees for each stage of revelation. That money built temples, it funded a priestly class, they held the keys to divine knowledge. Then there was the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother. It involved ecstatic rites. They offered liberation from earthly suffering, and in the hidden Mithria, the underground temples, soldiers and merchants gathered. They shared bread and wine. They acted out a cosmic drama, sacrifice and rebirth. These weren't open faiths. They were members-only clubs for the soul, tiered initiations, binding oaths of secrecy. That secrecy was their power. It created an in-group, bound by a shared, profound experience, a loyalty that could cross social class, could even, cautiously, challenge imperial allegiance. For the individual, this was invaluable. A soldier far from home, a merchant in foreign ports. The cult of Mithras mirrored the army's structure. It had its own ranks. The raven, the soldier, the lion, the father. A parallel hierarchy of spiritual merit inside the military machine. A centurion and a common legionary could kneel together as brothers in the Mithrium. Their earthly status erased by a higher, secret truth. It built a cross-class network, trust and obligation, operating just beneath Roman discipline. To the state, this was useful and threatening. These cults could build cohesion, offer morale, provide a solace the impersonal state cult could not. But a monopoly on divine favor that answered to no emperor was dangerous. When a cult grew too powerful, too independent, the reaction was swift: the Bacchanalian scandal. 2nd century before the Common Era, the Senate crushed the cult of Bacchus. They feared its secret night meetings, feared it undermined public order. Loyalty: the persecutions of Christians came from the same fear. Romans often saw them as a secretive mystery cult, a shadow hierarchy, competing for the ultimate allegiance of the people. These mystery cults show the final frontier for a shadow monopoly, the interior world, belief and belonging. They succeeded because they found a need the official monopoly couldn't meet. The need for personal salvation, a direct emotional encounter with the sacred. They packaged that need into an exclusive, tiered service, funded by the hopes of the initiates. Their power wasn't in controlling grain or metal. It was in controlling the narrative, the story of what happens after death, and the community that affirmed that story in life. They proved the most resilient monopolies answer the questions the state leaves unasked. They comfort the fears it cannot soothe. The human soul was looking for private answers. And it found them in secret rites, but the biggest change in the history of knowledge came from something quiet, physical, a change in the shape of a book. The scroll was the old standard, and it started to be replaced by the Codex, just sheets of parchment folded, bound along one edge. It looked like the book we know. And in that simple design there was a new kind of power, waiting. At first, the Codex was an underground tool. Early Christian communities preferred it. It was cheaper than a scroll, more durable. You could flip to a specific passage, fast for debate or for worship. It was portable, easy to hide. For a persecuted faith moving through the Roman Empire, it was the perfect technology. But then Christianity became the state religion, and everything changed. The Codex went from a tool of rebellion to an instrument of the establishment. The Western Roman Empire fell, chaos followed, and in that chaos, the only places preserving the old knowledge were the monasteries, isolated communities of monks behind high walls. They didn't just pray, they became factories of memory, scriptoria, the writing rooms. In there, in silence broken by the scratching of quills, the entire legacy of the ancient world passed through a very narrow filter. Monks spent their lives copying texts, not just the Bible and church writings, but also works of philosophy, history, medicine, from Greece and Rome. It was a monumental act of preservation, but it was also an act of control, a complete monopoly. The church now held a dual lock on knowledge. They controlled the physical means of production. The expensive parchment, the rare inks, the laborious, years-long process of copying by hand, and they controlled the content. The abbot, or a learned monk, decided which texts were worth copying, which were orthodox, which were dangerous. A work of pagan philosophy might be saved, but maybe with Christian commentary woven through it, reframing its meaning. A competing Christian text called heretical might be left to decay in a chest, or deliberately erased so the precious parchment could be used again. Literacy itself became a clerical privilege. To read was to interpret, and interpretation was the exclusive domain of the church. For the common person, the world was explained through sermons, through stained glass, through the rituals of the Mass. The written word, the source code of reality, was locked away in Latin, a language they didn't speak, inside books they could not touch. This created a vertical pipeline of truth. Information flowed one way, from God through Scripture, through the church's interpreters, down to the people. There was no feedback loop, no way to check the source. This monopoly on the Codex defined the medieval mind for centuries. It built a cohesive, continent-spanning ideology, a shared framework of sin and salvation, of natural law and social order. It gave the church immense soft power. Kings needed its blessing to rule, its courts handled law. Its calendar ordered time. All that authority flowed from its role as the sole guardian, the sole gatekeeper of the written word. But a monopoly built on scarcity is vulnerable to abundance. The first cracks appeared with the rise of secular universities. In places like Bologna and Paris, scholars began to debate theology and law using the church's own texts, sometimes reaching conclusions that challenged clerical authority. Then came paper, introduced from the Islamic world through Spain and Italy. It was far cheaper than parchment. It meant books could be produced outside monastery walls by lay scribes in the growing cities. The final, shattering blow was a machine, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press with movable type. Suddenly, the Codex was no longer a rare artifact crafted over a year. It was a commodity produced in weeks, in hundreds of identical copies. The Church's monopoly on the physical book evaporated overnight. The Bible was translated into common languages and printed. Martin Luther's protests were spread not by whispers, but by pamphlets rolling off presses across Germany. The single pipeline of truth exploded into 1,000 rivers. The Church's hold on the Codex shows the life cycle of a shadow monopoly. It starts with a pragmatic adoption of a superior technology. It consolidates into a system of ideological control, so complete it becomes invisible, the very air a society breathes, and it ends when the technology escapes. Democratized by cheaper materials and new methods of reproduction, the power shifted from those who guarded the book to those who could now read it for themselves. The book's monopoly was broken by a press, but the silver that paid for its pages, that was already moving. It was moving along older routes, colder routes. From the mines of the Islamic Caliphate, a river of silver dirhams pulsed north, through the lands of the Rus, down the Volga. It was headed for markets that wanted Eastern goods. And in the estuaries, in the river mouths, the Vikings were waiting. They didn't see this as trade. They saw a system to hijack. Their longships were the perfect tool for that. For interception, they had shallow drafts. They could sail up rivers where warships couldn't follow. They could be dragged over land at portages. They could appear where no one expected them. That gave them a monopoly, a brutal, mobile monopoly on liquidity itself. They controlled the choke points of Northern Europe's wealth. A merchant caravan was a slow target. A river barge loaded with chests of silver was a fat target. The Vikings moved fast, terrifying speed. They didn't just raid coastal monasteries for the easy gold. They set up fortified camps at key river junctions. From there, they could demand tolls for safe passage, or they could just take everything. It was a parasitic business model. Applied to an entire continent's cash flow, the silver they seized, it didn't just make them rich, it became seed capital for something new back home. That stolen wealth transformed Scandinavia. Chieftains who mastered the raid and toll system amassed fortunes that dwarfed inland kings. They used the silver to build great hall complexes, to fund vast feasts that bought loyalty, to commission jewelry that displayed power. Trading towns exploded into existence. Hedeby, Birka, these weren't just Viking towns. They were cosmopolitan hubs. Frankish swords changed hands there, Arabic silver, Baltic amber, Russian furs. The Vikings used their disruptive monopoly to build a legitimate trade network. A sprawling one, they became the middlemen they had once preyed upon. But a monopoly built on violence and mobility has a weakness, a fundamental weakness. It invites hardening defenses. The kingdoms of England and Francia started building fortified bridges across rivers. They established standing coast guards. They learned to fight the Vikings on their own terms. They made each raid more costly, and more importantly, the source of the silver began to falter. The mines in the Islamic world, the ones that produced all those dirhams, they gradually played out. The great river of wealth slowed to a trickle. The Viking Age didn't end with a single lost battle. It faded as the economic conditions changed, the conditions that made it possible. A parasitic monopoly needs a healthy host. When the host grows stronger defenses, and when its wealth diminishes, the parasite has to adapt or perish. Many Viking dynasties adapted, they settled, they Christianized, they became the Norman kings of Sicily, they became the rulers of the Kievan Rus. They traded their mobile, disruptive monopoly for fixed power, the territorial power of a traditional kingdom. Their legacy is a lesson in economic disruption. They proved a monopoly doesn't require owning a mine or a field. It can be built on controlling a corridor, on being the armed bottleneck in a system of exchange. An unpredictable one, their power was fluid. It literally followed the rivers of silver, and like water, it found the path of least resistance, until the landscape itself was reshaped to block its flow. Their story makes you look at any great flow of value and wonder. Who controls the narrows, and what happens when someone new arrives, someone with a faster ship and a sharper axe? What happens when they decide to take that control for themselves? The river of silver was a target, sure, but the state could also make money from its own citizens. By selling the right to tax them, that was tax farming. It turned public authority into a private monopoly. The state needed cash quickly, so it would auction the right to collect taxes in a province. To a syndicate of wealthy investors, the Romans called them Publicani. They'd pay the treasury a huge lump sum upfront. Then their agents would go out across the countryside to collect every coin they could. Anything over the bid price was pure profit. The incentive was perverse. It wasn't about collecting a fair share for public goods. It was about squeezing the population like a sponge, extracting the maximum possible return on a private investment. The state got its money immediately without the bureaucracy. But it had outsourced its most fundamental function, the right to levy tribute, to a profit-driven cartel that created a shadow monopoly on coercion itself. The tax farmer's collector wasn't just a civil servant, he was a businessman with armed guards. His bonus depended on how much he could take from a struggling farmer. In Ptolemaic Egypt, the system was refined. Every aspect of economic life was farmed out. The salt tax, the tax on looms, the records were meticulous. The pressure was relentless, but it was in the Roman Republic and later the early Empire where the consequences became explosive. In provinces like Asia Minor or Sicily, the Publicani were infamous. They could call in the legions to enforce collections. They could lend money at crushing rates to communities that couldn't pay, entrapping them in deeper debt. The line between tax collection and organized predation blurred entirely. For the local populace, the Roman state wasn't the distant Senate, it wasn't the emperor. It was the face of the tax farmer's agent at the door, demanding more than the land could yield. This privatized exploitation fueled a deep resentment. It wasn't just about poverty, it was about injustice. The state had licensed a predator to act in its name. Revolts were often sparked by this system. Like the Great Uprising in the province of Asia led by Aristonicus, it was a brilliant, terrible short-term fix. The treasury filled up fast. The political elite in Rome, who often invested in these syndicates, grew richer. But the long-term cost was the empire's legitimacy. Every coin extracted by the Publicani bought not just grain or soldiers, it bought a measure of bitterness. A quiet erosion of the belief that Rome brought law and order. The state had created a monopoly perfectly aligned to undermine its own foundation. It proved the most dangerous shadow monopoly might not operate against the state. But with its official blessing, wearing its cloak of authority while pursuing a private, relentless hunger, that search for silver up north it came from a deeper need in the south. A need for taste, for black pepper, where a handful could cost more than a man made in a year. The medieval world was caught in a spice vise, and the jaws of that vise were held by a chain of middlemen. A chain so long it felt unbreakable. Arab traders, they brought cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands. Caravans moved them to the Red Sea ports. The Mamluk sultans in Egypt, they taxed every sack that crossed their land. Then the Venetians, with their galleys and their contracts, they became the last link, supplying a Europe that was obsessed with that taste, with paradise. Every hand took a cut, and the price, it just kept climbing like a kind of economic magic, a king's ransom for something that grew on a vine. But this wasn't just luxury. It was about security. A kingdom's wealth was draining away, ship by ship, just to pay for a seasoning. The Portuguese, they were on the edge of Europe. They didn't have much, and they watched this gold flowing east. They saw it as a hemorrhage, a fatal one. Their whole economy was at the mercy of a shadow monopoly. One they couldn't touch, controlled by powers they saw as infidels. So the solution wasn't to bargain. It was to break the chain, to shatter it. Prince Henry the Navigator and those who came after him, they bet their kingdom's future on a wild idea. What if you could sail around Africa? What if you could reach the pepper's source and bypass every toll, every Venetian galley, every Mamluk tax collector? Vasco da Gama's voyage, that was corporate espionage, but on a continental scale. When his ships finally reached Calicut in India in 1498, he wasn't just opening a trade route. He was holding a knife to the throat of a system, a 1,000-year-old system. The spices were suddenly right there, within reach, and the Portuguese crown moved fast. They moved with brutality to secure that prize. This wasn't about free trade. It was about replacing one monopoly with another, a more violent one. They used their cannons. They took key ports, Goa, Malacca, Hormuz. They issued these naval passes, cartels. Every merchant ship had to buy one. If you traded in their ocean without their permission, they sank your ship. They built a fortified network, a state-run cartel, designed to control the spice trade right at its source. It was the same old shadow monopoly game, but now played on a global board with gunpowder. The goal was the same: create a bottleneck, control access, charge whatever the market would bear. And for a century, Lisbon grew rich, fantastically wealthy. Its skyline was built on pepper profits, but the model had the same old flaw. It demanded constant military force to maintain it. And it invited rivals, the Dutch and the English. They saw Portugal's success, and they decided to play the same game. The spice race turned into an arms race. Companies like the Dutch East India Company, they weren't just businesses. They were private corporations with the power to wage war, to negotiate treaties, to establish colonies. Their whole reason for being was to set up a monopoly and defend it. Then there was Columbus, his voyage funded by Spain. It came from the same desperate logic. He wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for a backdoor to the spice monopolies of the East. His accidental discovery, it unleashed a different kind of monopoly pursuit. Over land, over silver, over human labor in the Americas. So the scramble to break an old monopoly in the East, it accidentally triggered a new scramble. To create monopolies in the West, maps were redrawn, not by scholars, by accountants and admirals. The whole geopolitical order of the planet, it got reshaped by this one engine. The pursuit of exclusive control. And it shows you something. The shadow monopoly, it's not just a historical curiosity. It's a catalyst, a force that can drive men to sail off the edge of the known world. And in doing that, accidentally discover the shape of the modern one. The maps from the spice merchants and silver hunters have faded, but the patterns they made, we're still tracing them. The most powerful monopolies today, they're not guarding mountain passes or desert wells. They're guarding streams of data, lines of code, deposits of rare earth minerals. The old game of controlling the bottleneck, the essential resource, it hasn't ended. It's just upgraded its tools. The tech giants that shape our digital lives, they operate on principles a Roman tax farmer would recognize, or a Venetian spice merchant. They control the routes. In the ancient world, that was the Silk Road, the monsoon sailing lanes. Today, it's the digital pathways. The app stores, the search engines, the social media feeds that dictate what we see, how we connect. These are the new spice routes, and access to them is governed by algorithms, not armed caravans. Then there's the capital, like the temple bankers of Uruk who held the grain and the clay debt tablets. These companies hold vast reserves of a new kind of capital. Information capital, our preferences, our networks, our behaviors, our attention, all harvested, stored, analyzed in digital granaries. This data is the new frankincense. Its value isn't in its scent, but in its predictive power, and those who control its flow, they hold a quiet, pervasive influence over modern life. The tension with state power is a familiar echo, too. Kings and emperors wrestled with merchant guilds, priestly castes who held leverage they couldn't break. Today, governments grapple with corporate entities. Their reach and influence cross borders, challenging sovereignty, challenging regulation. The debates over antitrust laws, data privacy, platform governance, these are the modern versions of ancient disputes. The latest chapter in a long struggle over who gets to control the critical infrastructure of an era, whether it's made of stone, spice, or silicon. Seeing this long arc is crucial. It shows us that the concentration of control over a society's vital resources, Bronze Age tin, medieval salvation, 21st century lithium, and user data, it isn't a new problem. It's a recurring condition, a condition of complex civilization. This historical lens urges us to look past the sleek interfaces, the instant deliveries. To ask the old questions in a new context. Where are the bottlenecks now? Who controls the new sacred knowledge? Which dependencies are we building into our daily lives without even realizing it? The shadow monopolies of the past teach us something. Power often resides not in the obvious symbols of authority, but in the quiet, essential systems we all rely on. And recognizing those systems, that's the first step toward understanding the true architecture of our own time. These patterns, they show up again and over thousands of years. And they point to a kind of hidden grammar for power. You can break it down into 5 pillars, 5 distinct forms, and if you understand them, it's like having a diagnostic tool. A way to see the hidden stresses in any system, past or present. The first pillar is control of a necessity. It's the most direct form. It targets survival itself. The Roman grain dole, the Chinese salt monopoly, a desert kingdom holding the only well for 100 miles. When you control something every person needs every single day, you have a lever against the whole society. Your authority gets woven into the most basic rhythm of life. The second pillar is control of a luxury or a status symbol. This one targets desire and identity. Tyrian purple defining Roman social rank, black pepper as the ultimate symbol of wealth, obsidian blades in Mesoamerica as proof of divine connection. These monopolies work by embedding hierarchy into culture. They make the invisible lines of class into something you can see or taste or wear. To challenge it isn't just bad business. It becomes a kind of social heresy. The third pillar is control of knowledge or technology. This targets capability. It targets progress, the Hittites guarding the secret of iron smelting. The Egyptian priest scribes monopolizing writing and calculation. The medieval church controlling the production and interpretation of sacred texts. This power doesn't just give you an advantage. It actively prevents others from catching up. It creates a permanent gap, a gap between the knowing and the ignorant. The fourth pillar is control of spiritual access. This targets the soul, the afterlife, the oracle at Delphi selling interpretations of fate, the mystery cults offering exclusive salvation for a fee. The state priesthoods acting as the sole intermediaries to the gods. This monopoly answers the deepest human fears, the hopes that temporal power often leaves unaddressed. It trades in certainty about the unknown, and it offers community in a vast, impersonal world. The fifth pillar is control of logistics. This targets movement. Connection, the Sogdian masters of the Silk Road, metering the flow of ideas. The Viking raiders dominating the riverine silver routes of the north. The Portuguese cart as system controlling who sailed the Indian Ocean. This power doesn't require owning the source or the destination, just the narrow corridor in between. It's the power of the gatekeeper, the toll collector. The indispensable middleman. History shows that successful empires often didn't fight these pillars. They co-opted them. They became the monopoly. The pharaoh became the source of papyrus and divine law. The Roman emperor became the personal distributor of the grain dole. The Han dynasty didn't just tax salt. It owned the entire process. They absorbed the shadow power into the structure of the state itself. And conversely, falling empires were often strangled by these forces from the outside, or bankrupted by their cost from within. Rome drained its silver to pay for Eastern pepper and silk. The late Bronze Age kingdoms collapsed when the tin and copper cartels failed. An empire could command armies, but it couldn't command the harvest or the monsoon winds. Or the interpretation of a dream. The real power and the real danger came when these pillars combined. A single monopoly was a lever, but a web of them created a cage of dependency. Imagine a society where one group controls the grain you need to live, the written laws you must obey, the ritual that ensures a good harvest, and the trade routes that bring in everything else. That society isn't just governed, it is enveloped. Every aspect of life flows through the same set of hands. This fusion creates stability until it doesn't. And when it fails, every pillar falls at once. So this framework gives us a lens, a way to look at any civilization, any organization, any modern system. And ask the quiet questions. Where are the bottlenecks? Who controls the new necessities, the new forms of sacred knowledge, the new logistical pathways? What dependencies are we building right now without even seeing the pillars being erected around us? The empires of the past are a mirror, and in their reflection, we might just catch a glimpse of our own invisible architecture. The story of power gets written in quiet places, not on a battlefield but in a ledger, not in the throne room but in a temple archive. It goes from the first priest measuring grain in Sumer to the modern algorithm that curates your news feed. The contest is the same: who controls the essential thing, the thing you can't live without or believe you can't live without. These shadow monopolies show civilization is a negotiation between the visible authority of kings and the invisible authority of the people who manage the systems that feed us, connect us, explain the world, promise what lies beyond it. Real power has always flowed through those channels. It flowed through the scribe, the spice merchant, the tax farmer, the guild master. Their names are forgotten, but their architecture endures. Tracing their patterns, it's more than understanding the past. It's a lens for the present. You learn to ask different questions, not just who is in charge, but who controls the new sacred knowledge. The data that defines identity, not just who makes the laws, but who controls the new logistics, the digital pathways that shape relationships and economies. The old pillars of control: necessity, luxury, knowledge, spirit, logistics, they haven't crumbled. They've been recast in silicon and fiber optic cable. Bringing these systems into the light, it's not about assigning blame. It's about reclaiming awareness, recognizing the dependencies we build, often without a second thought. Every era has its own version of the spice cartel or the salt commission. The goal is to see ours clearly, to understand the architecture so we can navigate it with intention, maybe reshape it with wisdom. History's hidden economies remind us we are never passive. We are participants. Understanding the levers, we gain the agency to question them, to choose which dependencies we accept and which we challenge.